The conflict in the Middle East intensifies as Israeli jets continue to strike Beirut.
Israel has carried out airstrikes on the southern suburbs of Lebanon's capital, Beirut, for the first time in 5 days. It said it had targeted an underground warehouse used by Hezbollah. Well, the Israeli military issued an evacuation order early in the morning, telling residents of one building to leave immediately.
And on Wednesday, October 16th, Israel hit a municipal building in southern Lebanon, killing a town mayor and 5 others. This latest attack comes after Israel struck the Lebanese capital on the 10th of October, killing 22 people on that day. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently asked the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, a peacekeeping operation, to leave the country in preparation for more Israeli attacks. Israel previously assassinated Hezbollah leader Nasrallah and killed dozens of Hezbollah operatives using exploding pagers and walkie-talkies. Hezbollah's acting leader said on Tuesday, October 15th, that Hezbollah is focused on hurting Israel by targeting major cities like Tel Aviv. Hezbollah is heavily funded by Iran, which is also drawn into the conflict. And on October 4th, Iran launched ballistic missiles against military sites near Tel Aviv. Israel has vowed to retaliate, but promised to keep the retaliation close to Iranian military facilities. How will Israel's invasion of Lebanon evolve, and will a broader regional war be the final outcome? We're going to discuss this with Aram Nerguizian, Senior Associate with the Arleigh A. Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where his research areas lie in strategic and military dynamics in the Middle East and North Africa. Aram, good to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, David.
I'd like to play for you first a message from Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's a statement that he made 2 days ago on the 14th of October. Take a listen, and I'd like to get your response, please.
Hezbollah uses UNIFIL facilities and positions as cover while it attacks Israeli cities and communities. These attacks have claimed the lives of many Israelis, including yesterday. Israel has every right to defend itself against Hezbollah and will continue to do so. We regret any harm done to UNIFIL personnel, and the IDF is doing its utmost to prevent such incidents. But the best way to ensure the safety of UNIFIL personnel is for UNIFIL to heed Israel's request and to temporarily get out of harm's way.
Is he correct that UNIFIL is using Lebanese facilities as cover and hurting civilians in the process, as well as Israeli soldiers?
Well, I mean, the problem with any analysis of UNIFIL, David, is that at the end of the day, it's a structure that is trying to basically buffer between two forces. And in a sense, it's a regional punching bag. And it's been the case since the late 70s. That mandate has expanded since 2006. And I think it's important when we talk about the mandate to just come back to that. Asking UNIFIL to withdraw from South Lebanon doesn't solve the core requirement that UNIFIL is trying to reconcile. It is a force that is mandated by the Security Council. It is not a force that is mandated by the Secretary General and doesn't serve at the leisure of a force commander. So as far as UNIFIL troops and their leadership are concerned, barring a decision from the Security Council to vacate the South Litani sector, they have an obligation to commit to their mandate. Now that mandate operates in an enabling environment, or in most cases, a disabling environment. You need an Israeli military and civil structure that is working in lockstep with UNIFIL. Most days that is the case. You also need a Lebanese civil military environment that also is working with UNIFIL. And that is also most often not the case through a tripartite framework that takes place at the Nakura headquarters of UNIFIL itself. What that normally looks like is Israeli military personnel talking to UN and UNIFIL officials, Lebanese military and civil personnel talking to UN officials, and that's how it normally works. Right now, because of the pace and scale of conflict, the information warfare dimension of this from both the Israeli side and Hezbollah, both of which are trying to control some aspect of the battle space and information, UNIFIL is basically caught in the middle with very few good options. So I don't expect UNIFIL to vacate the space. I do expect both the Lebanese and the Israelis to find some reason to castigate or cast blame on UNIFIL and its personnel, but such is the nature of a very difficult mandate.
So 2 weeks ago, Israel, or the Israeli Defense Force, launched what they called a limited incursion into the south of Lebanon. It's unclear as to exactly how many Israeli troops are currently in Lebanon, but what would you say, Aram, is the primary objective or ultimate objective of the IDF?
Well, one of the core challenges we've had in understanding the overall strategic objective in terms of what the IDF is trying to accomplish, or rather what the government of Israel has tasked it with, is the lack of clarity on the end state. It's just too difficult to decipher a clear set of outcome from Israeli actions in civil military terms beyond trying to degrade Hezbollah in terms of its civilian and military command and control. What they've done in terms of operational deployment is far clearer. They have used a mix of special forces and air power supported by real-time ISR, it's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and targeted strike to degrade what the Israelis have come to believe is a mix of capabilities and infrastructure tied to Hezbollah in the south. What they have not done so far is an iteration of what we've seen in past conflicts involving the Israelis and Hezbollah, or Lebanon writ large, which is to say combine arms with infantry and mechanized units maneuvering into southern Lebanon, moving progressively towards the Tiny River. That has not been what we've seen thus far. So it's been a mix of interventions, limited strike, pulling back, re-engaging. And it hasn't been what many have predicted would be a all-out combined arms invasion. That's not to say, David, that there isn't a risk of mission creep. The more this goes on, and the more attrition on both sides becomes a pressure point or a pain point on the home front, the more there will be a risk that Israeli forces will have an expanding role in the south. And that would be a boon for Hezbollah and Hezbollah supporters to bog down a conventional military in a set of valleys and rolling hills where irregular forces can harass and ultimately damage conventional structures. That's the risk.
From an overall strategic objective perspective, how is this current invasion of Lebanon different or similar to the Second Lebanon War of 2006, which extended for roughly 34 days or so?
Well, for one thing, the 2006 war was at best a accelerated and somewhat haphazard intervention, utilizing a limited targeting pool and data set for attacks in Lebanon. You had a degree of targeting of infrastructure and civilian areas that had very little to do with Hezbollah in 2006, that did, frankly, far more damage to the Israelis' ability to credibly say that they were focusing on Hezbollah. What we have now is a set of escalating actions against command and control and decision-making tied to Hezbollah after not just years, but more than a decade and a half of careful intelligence collection, counter-espionage and espionage, and penetration of Hezbollah, and the kind of decapitation action at the command and control level that has left very few leaders in Hezbollah that are frankly of a generation older than yourself or I. All of that human capital is gone. That doesn't mean they don't have battlefield commanders, but it's far more at the operational and tactical level. The targeting has been massive in terms of its impact and the ability to strike deep into areas like Dahia, the southern suburbs of Beirut. I don't think that, unlike in 2006, you don't really have as much of a focus on avoiding some of these larger civilian structures, in part because the Israelis have built up a cascade of attacks. Most civilians have left that area, and you have far better intelligence and data collection. So it's far more impactful in terms of the damage Hezbollah has sustained. The Israelis have suffered thus far less relative attrition, but in a sense, they're also far more willing to absorb losses than in 2006. That's a consequence of the mix of psychological effects and impact of post-October 7th Israel. You have an Israeli civil military environment that understands, or at least they feel they understand a need to absorb losses if and when they should become necessary. And on the side of the Iranians and Hezbollah, I think they've been a bit flat-footed in understanding just how much Israeli civil military decision-making and risk appetite has changed in terms of interventions in places like Lebanon.
You are well versed on ongoing situation with the Lebanese Armed Forces, the official military of Lebanon. What are they doing right now? What is their involvement?
The Lebanese military has gradually been expanding out since 2005 into a more cohesive national security role. 15 years, the Syrians had essentially intelligence and military dominion over Lebanon. And it's taken some time and quite a bit of external assistance to get the LAF to the point where, yes, they're doing internal security, but they're also doing things like expanding the authority of the state, places like the Bekaa and the border with Syria. Now, before October 7th, there was an aspiration in the Lebanese military to play a larger role in the south and to gradually play a larger consolidated border security role. But that was aspirational. There were no illusions about the challenge of expanding that so long as Hezbollah was preeminent. Now, October 7th has created a mix of volatile conditions that on the one hand, an opportunity that in a sense, both Hezbollah and the Israelis in the early days of the conflict recognized that, okay, the state of war exists now, but at some point the fighting must end. And there needs to be a structure that both sides can look to as a predictable, accountable actor to maintain peace and calm in the South Litani sector. Now, that was back in December, February. It was before this cycle of escalation between Israel and Hezbollah starting in July. Now, the LAF's posture in the South Litani sector is still somewhat fragile. It's been fragile since 2006. It's been described by some as expeditionary. That means no bunkers. Most units are exposed. They have limited ability to defend themselves. They have no air defenses. And you have a real risk if you have something like a ground war between Israeli regular forces and Hezbollah irregulars, with the LAF being basically caught in the middle. Now, there are some in Hezbollah, certainly, who would love for the LAF to be on their side in terms of taking the fight to the Israelis or being more directly involved in fighting the Israelis. But the Israelis but the Lebanese Armed Forces have no appetite for some reenactment of the charge of the Light Brigade in a strip of about 5 kilometers north of the Blue Line that will be a killing field. And they have a far larger focus on preserving a force that, when the dust settles, will have to play a far larger role in national security politics. And they do all of that while also bearing in mind that you have heightened sectarian tensions as Shiites displaced from the south move to areas where you have other communities who are or are not welcoming of displaced Hezbollah supporters and also just displaced persons in general in a country where sectarian tensions and an equilibrium are always fragile. So they have to also look to that aspect of maintaining stability in Lebanon. So that's a difficult posture for any national military, especially one that is not like the Egyptian or the Israeli or the Jordanian military, which is to say, preponderant in national security affairs.
Prime Minister Netanyahu has claimed several times that the fight is against Hezbollah, not against the Lebanese people. He said this multiple times.
I have a message for the people of Lebanon. Israel's war is not with you. It's with Hezbollah.
2 days ago, on the 14th of October, Israeli Defense Forces struck an airstrike, struck an apartment building in the north of Lebanon in the town of Aito, which I believe is a part of the country's Christian region. Hezbollah is a Muslim group. Why was a Christian city struck?
Well, if groups like Hezbollah and Hamas operated the way their conventional adversaries, whether it's Israel or any ally of Israel in the region, then they would be in exposed territory. They would be far away from civilian targets. And that's not a set of strategies that I think any military or regular force would adopt. And when you have a group like Hezbollah trying to cultivate a set of strategic relationships that ensure that it can operate either free from that threat Israeli air power and target strikes, or with some degree of resilience, that means striking political bargains. And part of that has been, since 2006, to cultivate relationships with, among other things, some Christian political groups. These are not unusual in Lebanon sectarian politics. You have these cross-confessional alliances. And in peacetime, they are a source of balancing and balance of power politics. But today, especially in a world where post-October 7th, the safety catch, so to speak, in terms of how Israel does or doesn't go after targets in so-called mixed areas, where you have certainly Shiite communities, but also non-Shiite communities. This is going to happen. There are stockpiles, there are command and control nodes, there are key personnel that are intermixed with communities that are not, strictly speaking, Shiite, that are also not, strictly speaking, tied to Hezbollah. And we're going to see this play out more and more. This is going to put pressure in two ways. On the one hand, it's going to put pressure on those groups that have made alliances with Hezbollah. Insofar as, look what you brought upon us. You have constituents who are going to react and whose concern will be manifest. But that also has the risk of flipping on a dime, where these are Israeli airstrikes. And if you have misplaced strikes and you have just enough of them for Hezbollah to say, or to at least convincingly make a case that, look, this is not just because we work with you, non-Shiite or non-Hezbollah parties and factions. The Israelis actually are targeting you. That's part of the information battle space that the Israelis and Hezbollah are trying to dominate.
This leads to the next question of civilian or limiting civilian casualties. Now, according to the Ministry of Health of Lebanon, more than 1,000 casualties in Lebanon. Civilian casualties have been reported so far. Netanyahu has claimed that Hezbollah is using civilians as human shields. So two-part question. A, is he right? And B, if he is right, in some sense, what would be the IDF strategy to limit civilian casualties if civilians are integrated with Hezbollah?
Well, this is a kind of a chicken and egg problem. On the one hand, it's true that any irregular force that is operating in a space, for example, in the case of Hamas, as tightly packed as Gaza in terms of urban density, or in the case of Hezbollah in an area that is quite large, but still quite limited in terms of battle space, as is the South Litani sector. You just have only so many options in terms of how to operate effectively without co-locating with civilian infrastructure, in some cases willingly. So for me, it's not a question of human shields or not human shield. It's a question of common sense, irregular warfare tactics. Now, on the other side of that equation is the fact that this has been going on long enough. By that, I mean, since October 8th, since Hezbollah started firing rockets at Israel, that you've had an escalating cycle of internal displacement. You have more and more Lebanese, and also, frankly, many displaced Syrians from that civil war, who have been moving away from the south, moving away from areas that are perceived as being targeted by Israeli air power, Israeli ground forces, special forces. And in some cases, you have people moving even to Syria. You've had on the order of 280,000 people move across the Lebanese-Syrian frontier, according to the United Nations. Now, this is not unexpected. This is not like 2006, where people don't have time to deal with a lightning set of engagements. This has been ratcheting up over a period of a year. So you have, on the one hand, a far harder time making the case that there are civilians co-mixed in places like the South, the Litani sector, but there are also going to be people who are not going to leave their homes. The history of the Lebanese in successive crises, going back to the 19th century, never mind the last civil war, is that if you leave, you never come back. So there is that pressure for local communities trying to tough it up, including Christian villages along the Blue Line, who have every reason to stay for fear of never returning and trying to stay out of the conflict between the Israelis and Hezbollah.
So the last part of our segment, let's talk about what's next. Have the Israelis completed, in your opinion, their objective in southern Lebanon?
I think the question in itself begs the question whether we have a clear understanding of Israel's objectives. Yes, they said they want to degrade Hezbollah. Yes, they said they want to degrade Iran's ability to project power in the Mediterranean. And I think it's a fair assessment that any Israeli government in the next decade is going to do whatever it takes to limit the ability of irregular groups supported by Iran or anyone else to operate along Israel's borders and frontiers. That we understand. What we have a far harder time unpacking or zeroing in on is what is the strategic end state? And that is a question that is also being asked within the United States government interagency. Yes, there is a long arc of support for Israel's qualitative military edge. And yes, the United States and other partners are often concerned about the influence of Iran and its ability to not only attack Israel, but also disrupt trade in the Gulf, whether it's the Strait of Hormuz or the Bab el-Mandeb tied to the Red Sea. But that doesn't give us a clear sense of what happens in the day after. What does civil military government and governance look like in a post-conflict Lebanon? What will the balance of power look like between the mix of factions, whether it's Hezbollah, some weird transformed version of Hezbollah, because it's not going to be the Hezbollah we knew. The Iranians, are they going to focus on reconstituting Hezbollah politically? Are they going to do so militarily? They can't do both because the Israelis will interdict that. And what is the ultimate objective in Israel vis-a-vis Iran? Is it regime change? Is it targeting the nuclear program? All of those things have knock-on consequences, and all of those lead to one degree or another of strategic escalation on an order that we haven't seen yet in the Middle East.
Well, to close off, we have a few minutes left. Can we speculate as to what the strategic evolution may be? For example, Naim Qassam, who is the current leader of Hezbollah, acting leader, that is, has vowed to hurt Israel, quote unquote, hurt Israel. Two-part question. Does Hezbollah actually possess the ability to hurt Israel beyond Lebanon and the Lebanese border? And second, would they just rely more on Iranian-backed military groups to strike Israel in retaliation?
Look, before the decapitation strikes against Hezbollah, from Iran's perspective, Hezbollah was like an Ohio-class nuclear ballistic missile submarine operating in open water and ready for a second strike against Israel or to deter Israeli and other forces. Now it looks like a battleship throughout Pearl Harbor, except that the Iranians don't have the advantage of being able to tow Hezbollah to port to refit it. They're going to have to try and reconstitute a proxy ally under fire. The Iranians have been taking losses as they've tried to reconstitute command and control of Hezbollah. It's not an easy scenario for the Iranians, because on the one hand, they can't reconstitute Hezbollah as it once was. If they were to overfocus on restoring deterrence by pursuing a nuclear program, that all but assures a risk of regime change, if not targeted strikes, on an order of magnitude the Iranians haven't seen. And then there's the wider question of how do you do any of this in the middle of a lame duck presidential cycle in the United States, where Israel has a window of some degree of flexibility to continue to strike against Iranian proxies. So look, Hezbollah is doing what it was designed to do as far as Iran is concerned, which is take the punches. But when all is said and done, it's a depreciating asset that is going to become something different than what we've known over the last 30, 40 years. That's at the strategic level. We haven't even talked about the domestic level, which is transforming in real time. Every other faction has done a relatively decent job of not getting overly bellicose about the state that Hezbollah is in, but there is that temptation. And Lebanon is on a knife's edge between finding some kind of post-conflict accommodation when all is said and done versus escalating into either localized or a wider national civil war in the worst case.
Very good. Thank you very much, Aram. I appreciate it. Where can we learn more from you?
If you can pull up the CSIS website and you can look at the Burke Chair in Strategy and the Emeritus Chair in Strategy, where you'll find a whole host of reporting by me and my colleagues at the center.
Thank you very much. We'll put the links down below. And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.